Ready? All right. All right, colleagues, let's indeed get started. Maybe I'll close the door there. Yeah.
There's not enough air in the room.
Oh, there's not enough air.
No,
There's not enough air.
that's-
We let some
yeah.
air. That's good then, yeah. So I'm very happy, Anil, to have you I could say back with us today, because it's not the first time I believe that you're visiting the European Trade Union Institute. You all know that Anil Verma is a professor in Canada. I believe you have flown in this morning, so
Yes.
I feel that you look very fresh actually for having flown all night. I don't know how you do that. I wouldn't be able to, but okay, you're tough cooking, I suppose.
We landed at 8.
Yes.
We didn't leave the airport till 10:30.
Oh no! Oh well, welcome to Belgium. There was a strike, I suppose.
There was a strike.
Yes. Okay.
And it was one of your affiliates.
Ah, I don't take any credits for our affiliates, but welcome to Belgium. I think Kurt can give her some data about the strikes. So. Anyway, so very welcome to you. You're a professor emeritus at the Rodman School of Management and the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources of the University of Toronto. You've been visiting the ETUI before. You're coming tomorrow with the student group, I believe, and you brought one of the students already, so that's excellent. I will have the chance to welcome you and those young people here tomorrow. I think many of you know that Anil is really a very important contribution to industrial relations and human resources scholarships and practice. I won't go into that because the detail of that is included in the invitation, the text that you made for this day. Jane, thanks for that.
I studied at Rome.
You studied there. Well, that's good. So you know all that. Anyway, so we have an expert here in employment relations, notably, and we will hear about that today. Regarding participative forms of work organization, policy responses to technology and globalization, international labor standards, and also lifelong learning. You've worked with a number of international organizations, with the ILO, the OECD, and others. I think Jane will refer to that at some point as well, because we're also doing research for the ILO and with the ILO for the moment that is, I think, relevant for today's discussion. So, Jane, I leave that to you to refer to that. I'm also happy Anil is the second speaker in our new ETUI lunchtime session. So I'm happy to continue that. So the idea is to have one of our guests, friends in our network, to present their work and then just to chat very informally with good sandwiches and what are those? Muffins, exactly, because that is always inspiring. So some important questions will be put to the table. Are notably whether our institutions in Europe and globally, and because you will have a broad perspective, are adequate to provide a voice to all workers at the workplace. I think we already know the answer to that question, but it's a very pertinent one since we know that only, in fact, a small minority of workers worldwide have access to effective voice and protection under the law. And that is not only the case outside Europe, but to a large extent also within the European Union, with a growing number of workers not being reached by trade union organizations. So I will leave it at that because I will especially want to make sure that you have enough time to speak, but also that we have time for discussion. That is very important. It's not a one-way street. We really want to have a dialogue between. So I hand it over to Jane. Jane, thanks for initiating this lunchtime session, and I leave it in your able hands while I will be eating. Thank you. There you go.
Thank you very much, Bart, and a big warm welcome to you, Anil. It's lovely to see you again. And also your students that I've only met Marine so far, but I believe they'll be on the premises very shortly. And of course, we at the ETUI will look forward to discussing all issues about work and unions with them, given your time available. Today's seminar, I think, speaks to the heart of why trade unions exist and for whom. So I was really delighted when you proposed this topic area because it is absolutely massive, as we know. I think it's something like 2 billion people on the planet are informal economy workers. So we're not dealing with a minor issue here. And I'm delighted that you'll be focusing on the waste pickers as well to help provide a case study, if you like, and give some ramifications for what it's like for informal economy workers generally. I would like to mention at this point also that Anil is engaged with a forthcoming book at the ETUI on trade unions and greening the economy. And we're delighted he's going to be writing the preface for that text, not out for some time. We also have other contributors in the room, including good self, Galina. Thank you very much for coming on board with that. And we really, really appreciate your input into that. So with regard to today, Anil, I think you'll be speaking for about 35 minutes, is that correct? Okay, and then we will open the floor to everybody for your questions and hope to have a very engaging discussion for the rest of the session time. I think as Bart and Maria may have mentioned, we will be recording this session, and this is a recording that we will then add to a forthcoming repository online for the ETUI around these ETUI lunchtime sessions. Okay. We think it's a useful resource base from our esteemed speakers to start to develop. And I'll speak with Compute more about that as it grows legs. So just in closing, I'd like to thank Maria Nikolova and Bart van Herke and other colleagues for helping to bringing their organizing talents to bear today. And with no further ado, I'd like to now hand over to Anil to commence his talk. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bart. Thank you, Jane, for that warm welcome. Can you hear me back there?
Yeah.
You can hear me? Okay, maybe I'll just stand here so you can see me better. Yes, I arrived this morning and I'm very happy that I was not late for the seminar, which I was ready. And okay, maybe a couple of things about my background and where we go with this talk, just to set things in a proper context. So I'm not a lawyer, even though where I end up with this talk is that I'll leave you with a question which is essentially about the law. So I may be on slippery ground there, but I said, why not go out on a limb? You know, let's have some big ideas, even if they're not so workable right away, but that's how you start the conversation. And the second thing is that my background is in what we call industrial relations. Now, this doesn't translate very well in Europe, but in the English-speaking world, it's basically labor relations, human resources. Anything to do with people in organizations and their relations with their masters, with their supervisors, managers, owners. You know, that interface is where we are at, industrial relations. And most of my work, going back to my own PhD work, and then the subsequent, was all set in the plant level, office level or plant level. So I'm going to companies, mostly private sector, looking at the relations between workers and managers and how that exchange is mediated by unions or pseudo unions, that where there were not legally recognized unions, we had pseudo organizations. So it is that perspective from which I do my own research. And this talk today was sparked by some work that I did at a more macro level, which is the subject of our course, where the students are here, is we look at what efforts are underway internationally to bring labor regulation to trade that crosses boundaries, because that doesn't fall under any national jurisdiction, but it's really international activity. And it was largely unregulated. I should say it is largely unregulated even today, although we have now made some beginnings in that area. So that was at a macro level. At the micro level, we did some work with informal workers. And what I'm going to share with you is the work done in Brazil with waste pickers who have literally no voice. They're the most powerless group of workers. And when I put the two together, the big picture and the micro, then this idea emerges that I'm going to share with you. So if you bear with me, I will run through some of these slides quickly because it's ground that you know well. This is a specialist crowd. Now, how do I move it? Oh, there. Okay, finally responded. So here I just tried to think aloud. What are the ways in which workers have voice that are protected by law? So, we have at the right-hand side, you see, we have unions that are at the establishment level. This is common in North America. We have enterprise unions in Japan and Korea. We have corporatist unions that are common in Latin America. We have works councils that are very common in Europe, in addition to unions. And we have some yellow unions that are really controlled by the employer. So this is the lay of the land. But where we are today is that we have all these external shocks like freer trade, climate disruption, pandemics. And with the result that employment has become more precarious, fragmented, and not just at the lowest levels of the skill scale, but it's happening across the board now. So it doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a scientist, or you are a factory worker or a guy delivering pizzas in Toronto. You're all being precarioused, fragmented, and disempowered. So I wanted to ask the question, what share of the workforce is informal? What share is formal and has a union or access to collective bargaining? And what share is formal but is not represented by a union? And I tell you, these numbers are impossible to get. So I did a back of the envelope calculation. So if any of you want to quote this, cite this, be very careful, because these are my numbers, approximate calculations by the author based on. So I took whatever I could get from the ILO, from the World Bank, from OECD, and I extrapolated across the sectors so I broke it down by the total, and you see that 60% is informal, so that's majority, and only about 10%, these are the privileged workers, 335 million, maybe 350 million, give or take, some variation in numbers, and 1 million who are in the formal sector, but they don't have a union. Then if you split this by high income, so the World Bank has a classification of countries, high, middle, and low. So I took the high separate and I combined the low and middle. So if you look within the high income, well, the informal sector is small, but not insignificant, 13 to 15%. We're talking about 100 billion people, right? The formal non-union sector is quite big, and unions roughly 16. It used to be higher, but we've had a slide in the last 20 years. And then if you do the numbers for low and middle income economies, look, the informality jumps to about almost 3/4. So the conclusion that one has to take from this, yes, please.
I'm the one asking the naive questions. How formal non-union workers vote? What do you mean by that?
So let's say if you
That's why
want,
we have a shared understanding
Yeah.
of what you mean by that.
I'll give you an example. So if you work for Amazon
Mhm.
in the US, you are a formal employee, you're recognized by the law as an employee, you're on the payroll, so you're formal in that sense. But you have If you have a problem with your employer, if you're being harassed or not being paid overtime, or you have unsafe work, your only choice is to either quit the job or to suffer on the job.
Sure.
There is no voice. You don't have recourse. File a complaint, be heard, be protected by the law. So,
Okay.
so that's and this has grown a lot. So now, just very quickly, we don't have to go through this chart, but this is my summary chart of international initiatives where we are trying to regulate labor. We're trying to give some voice to workers. So we have some hard laws that are either in the free trade agreements, a formal agreement, or some people are trying to work litigation in some countries to see if domestic laws can apply to companies, even if the harm done was overseas in some other, that the lawyers call extraterritoriality of law, trying to extend that. We have firm level codes of conduct, industry level codes of conduct. We have CSR, general principles like UN Global Compact and the UN GP, the guidelines for transnational corporations. We have the ILO and all its conventions, etc. And we also have a modicum of international collective bargaining. You put it all together, and this is an exercise me and my students undertake in this course. We try to assess each of these to ask the question, what has it done for bringing voice to the worker? So you've heard of fair trade coffee, right? But we want to know if that bloke who is picking coffee beans in Africa or Central America or South America, if his or her conditions have improved. Are they getting better? Are they better paid? Do they have safer work? Do they have a grievance procedure? Do they have a way to report about harassment on the job? And the answer is beautifully small. So the effects are so small that they're almost unobservable in many cases. And even when they are, the effects are very small. So let me go to the Brazilian example. And I just want to share this with you is that our concept of voice, the way it is derived, the generic idea is workers should have voice. And the way they get voice is through their labor organization, through their collectivity. We have to, through policy, make sure that the organization is sustainable. This is an important part. This is what we call union security. And they should have the right to dialogue with the employer or with the adversary and negotiate contracts and enforceable rights. So this is the general framework. The way it works in, I call this the modern era, which is basically 20th century, is that you have voice, but the voice is vis-a-vis an identifiable employer. So the whole model breaks down when you don't have an identifiable employer. And they form trade unions. They can negotiate dues checkoff, so that the employer can pay the union dues. They engage in collective bargaining and you have collective contracts. So this is how we did. Now let's go to this, this is a paper that was presented at a conference that Kalina organized and then was published in this journal that you can read, just to give you some idea. Brazil is one of the few countries in the world where the government, through policy, encouraged formation of waste picker associations. So they're not unions in the membership union sense. They are cooperatives. And We went to a number of them. Here you can see one of them in a small town, 5,000 population town, this one. Very poor by European standards, but resourceful and politically empowered. These workers want a better life. So here they have a shed, they bring the trash, they sort it here, and then they sell to. And look, this is pictures revealing because most of them were women, at least in this case. But across the board, the majority are women. There are sometimes it's balanced 50-50, but many of them had majority women. So there's more women. But here they have uniforms, they have safer work. So let me give you the summary. And let me start with the outcomes here. We found that workers who were part of an association had higher earnings, they had safer work, and they had formal recognition of their role and contribution, mostly through the municipal government, the local government. And in a variety of ways, the local government would support them or encourage them or give them an ID, because a lot of waste pickers are seen as scavengers and thieves. You know, they're rummaging through your trash, they're stigmatized. And meanwhile, they're doing a very useful function. You know that bulk of the trash that is recycled today in the world, the bulk of it, no, I don't have a number to give you, but if I were to guess, 80 to 85% of trash that is ever recycled globally goes through the hands of a waste picker. It's not your formal recycling programs that do it. It is the waste pickers who do it. So they're contributing a lot, especially to the environment and to their communities. But look at their situation. They have no voice protected by the law. Now, they have these associations, but in every single case, in all the cases we studied, they needed some seed funding that came from an international, national, local, or private organization. So without that, you can't have any association. They don't have market power. So even when they sort the trash, what do? You have to sell to a recycler. Actually, they sell to a middleman who then sells to a recycler. So they're at the bottom of the value heap. So they get very little economic value that is captured in the recycled trash. In many cities and towns, they don't have access to the trash. People lock the trash. And they would not be given access, even though they're doing a legitimate business. There's social stigma. And we found that in cases where the city issued them an ID and designated them as a community environmental worker, they acquired more self-esteem and more recognition from their own communities that, you know, they're contributing. And of course, there is a huge skill set there, because who goes into trash picking? These are people who have no education, they're poor, and they have no alternatives in the labor market. So you are getting people but they're politically aware, and then they could do with some help in organizing their office and so forth. Okay, Bart already mentioned that the question was, what relevance does this have to EU? But we have workers who don't have voice here. So let me now go to my conclusion. What happens in the case of waste pickers is that they have voice, but it's not vis-a-vis an identifiable employer, right? Who do they represent themselves to? To organizations and governments who control the resources that they need. They need the trash. they need a place to sort, they need to sell their stuff and get a fair value. These are the organizations with which they need to bargain. And their organization is a co-op, or you can call it an NGO. To make them sustainable, they need managerial skills, financial skills, seed funding, fair price for the recyclables. And if they have to bargain, what bargaining rights the law could possibly give them? Well, the right to consultation before you process the trash, how you're going to handle it, and how they can be part of the recycling program. A fair price for sorted recyclables. And if they had these rights, they could bargain and they could write contracts, but that part is not there yet. So what I'd like to conclude with to leave you with is that we have to find a way to generalize the right to voice and not to have it tied up with a particular form of employment or employer, which is where the rights are right now embedded in law. So let me go through 4 conclusions that come out of this. Is the right to voice should be in the context of economically productive work, not just employment. So economic activity happens outside of employment as well, particularly for the self-employed, and West speakers are classified as self-employed in many countries. So the question is, do they have a right to voice? And this could be guaranteed under the law, but not under a trade union law, but more at a meta law level, which could be, for example, embedded in the Constitution. So you could say everyone who's engaged in economic activity has a right to voice in carrying out their activity. Now, what form it takes can follow and can be a lower level law. And a variety of forms of work organization should be recognized by the law. A trade union, a co-op, or an association. So workers have to form the kind of organization that they can, that they're able to, and it can still be nested within the trade union. But right now, until you become a trade union, you don't have the protection of the law. And all I'm saying is extend this protection to other forms of organization. Thirdly, what rights should they acquire? Should they be recognized? Well, they should at least have the right to information and consultation and the right to bargain with whatever entities that control the resources they need to carry out their work. So it could be a local government, it could be a state government, it could be a corporation. So they would have the right to bargain or engage in social dialogue with any of these entities, not just their employer. And for low-wage work, and this is a case study of the West speakers, for low-wage work, they're never going to have voice. And if you think this is important to society, if this is an important social value, then we should oblige our governments to provide funding to help form these associations. This is a little bit an outreach. It's not just saying that government is just sitting there making laws and is the neutral arbiter, but it is actually an activist role for the state to go into these communities. And so, for example, in the case of West speakers, there can be an NGO, a national NGO, funded by the government, whose job would be to provide resources to cities and states in fostering place picker associations. That's what this would be. And I'd like to end by saying that this is the postmodern era, once you decouple voice from an identifiable employer, then it opens up, creates space for a more larger variety of organizations, more variety in labor protections, and more different types of bargaining and with different players. In passing, I want to mention that the ILO, in its centenary declaration 2019, had much more universalistic language than before. Although some people in the ILO said, no, we were always universal. But it's now more prominent, a labor protection floor for all workers. And if we are saying all, then let's not ignore the 72% who are informal. And let me end by saying that the human capability framework that's made famous by the Nobel Prize winning Amartya Sen, who said that real freedom comes when you allow every human being to develop their own capability. And what I submit to you is the right to voice is intricately linked to human capability. If we don't have voice, we are not going to be able to attain our potential. And this idea actually came to me when a student in one of my classes asked, we were talking about modern slavery and forced labor. So who is forced? What about you and me? I work for the university. I got to do what the university tells me, right? So how am I different from a slave? Well, and my answer is, because I have right to voice. I have rights vis-a-vis my university in a variety of ways, and I can exercise that right. But if you are a worker for Amazon, and no matter how well it pays or what the conditions are, if you don't have voice, then perhaps you are like a modern slave. So it's a bit extreme, but think about that. I think people who don't have voice at work, they are working in slave-like conditions. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anil. I mean, that I think provides us with some really interesting, new, fertile conceptual areas to consider, as well as what's happening in practice. I omitted earlier, apologies, to give you all an opportunity to introduce yourself. So perhaps before we embark on questions, we could quickly do that now for Anil to know who's in the room as well. So if you could just say who you are, perhaps where you're from, and then we'll start with the question names in earnest. So maybe we can start with Maria. You go around the table.
I'm Maria. I work at the ETUI as communication officer, and I organize this kind of events.
I'm Bart van Herk. I also work at the ETUI, director of the research department.
Michel, historian.
Roland Gendreder, I'm president of BeLife, which is a humanitarian structure funded by the Open Space Agency to provide mobile biological laboratory to crisis areas.
Sergei Kostianov, I'm with Professional Government Association of Ukraine. I have experience of founding alternative unions with Ukraine before. And I studied at Rotman School. Business executive program.
Hello, my name is Fut van Dalen, researcher at ETUI. I'm working on trade union.
Yeah, my name is Van Mindi. I'm an education officer at ETUI. Hello, I'm Fabrice Dornec from INDEO. That is an organization that coordinates activities of lawyers who are friends of trade unions.
My name is Alvin Derlinger. I'm a librarian in the Central Library of the European Commission.
Hello, I'm Eva Miko. I also work at the European Commission in DG Education, Culture, Youth and Sport.
Anna Maria Capitani. I was executive secretary at Conica Minolta.
At the, sorry.
Conica Minolta.
Konika.
Yeah.
Okay.
Copying machine,
Yeah,
printers, medical instruments.
Yes, now I know. Thank you.
I'm Manuel Lavas and I work at ETUI as a researcher.
Hi, I'm Kalina Arabajirva and I'm a senior researcher also at ETUI.
Suleiman, je suis Miss retraité.
No, I should have said earlier, I'm Jane. I'm a researcher here at ETUI and an adjunct professor at Cassie University in New Zealand.
Hi everyone, my name is Maureen. I'm a student of Professor Verma and I'm studying at the Center of Industrial Relations and here with some other students as well.
Right, thank you very much, everybody. So I'm sure we've got a ton of things to ask, and I'll do my best to come around the room and put them in some sort of order. So, Kalina, perhaps we can start with you.
Yeah, so
That would be great.
thank you so much for this, Anil. Also, obviously I am familiar with the paper and your work on this. I love this paper. It's so interesting, thought provoking. I have sort of a comment and a question. My comment is actually, the question was posed, okay, what does this particular topic of informal workers and waste pickers, is that relevant to the EU? So I come from Bulgaria, where this is very much relevant because there are a lot of waste pickers. I mean, I come from Sofia, but I think that this is a phenomenon that's very kind of countrywide. And in fact, Bulgaria has the highest rate of e-waste recycling. And that is not because there are containers, that is not because there is any particular system, that is not because people are conscious, but that is because when you have cables to throw away, you put them downstairs next to the bin and somebody comes to pick them up. And last year I cleaned out my grandparents' apartment and I thought, okay, e-waste, very important. The formal process, you call the municipality. If somebody picks up, they're like, yes, we'll call you in the next 5 days. They don't call you in the next 5 days, by which time I don't live there, so I've left the country. So the next time what I just did is I just took everything down. And even as I was taking it down, somebody was going around. So, and I think this is why when I actually read your paper, I was like, wow, actually, this is incredibly interesting that there was such, success in being able to sort of organize these workers. So I just want to say this is relevant to Europe too, especially, I mean, Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans, but I'm sure not only. And my question was, can you tell us a little bit more about, what were the incentives of the government to support these associations? So, how come it happened? How come it happened in Brazil? Was it because it was a particularly kind of like a left-wing government of the municipalities, or was it because it was a growing problem? And was there any involvement of trade unions in that at all?
I can tell you the Brazilian story is very simple, but that it is happening in many other countries now is a more complex story that needs to be studied. So in Brazil, it all goes to the first administration of the Lula government. Lula himself comes from a poor background. He grew up poor. He didn't have money to go to school. So he has lived in neighborhoods where waste pickers were at. So in his first administration, there is a federal directive, it's in our paper, that he said it was not required, but was encouraged. And he provided seed funding from the federal government to the states and to municipalities. And they also started a recognition program. So every year they would pick the best examples and recognize them. So he did a lot of activism to promote the waste pickers. Then after he was out of power, the other government completely ignored the program. So starved the program for funding, so things slowed down. But when he came back to power a couple of years ago, he has again put renewed emphasis on it. And I think without his initiative, and if you look at places where you have right-wing governments in Latin America, there's much less progress. So what can we do? Well, first you have to elect a progressive government. You know, a government has to see this as being important. And now we have around the world so many governments that basically don't give an F for people who are downtrodden because they're working for billionaires. You know, how can we increase our wealth? So if the state is not on side, it's impossible because formal workers can take on the government. You know, they can organize strikes, they can resist. But the informal workers, it's much harder for them to organize and resist. So, or to make the government give them this. But now, Indonesia and Philippines and India, there are a lot of grassroots level movements to organize the informal workers. And who knows, maybe in the next 10 years, in the next 5 years, this will be a bigger global movement. Let's hope so.
Yes. Auckland?
No, please, Alva.
I interpreted your body language. As
Yeah,
if you
but-
were going
yeah,
to be.
I did, but not yet, so.
Okay, happy to go.
I'll ask
Accept.
you.
Yeah, so perhaps, yes.
I have one question about in relation to the current trend to develop human rights due diligence, especially in multinational companies. We see that many HRDD plans involve some voice system. And the last 2 years I was working with for an NGO in the electronic sector, and we had discussions with the industry of electronics, Responsible Business Alliance. You may know it, Responsible Business Alliances. They organize the defense of the industry's interests, especially regarding workers' voice. And they have set up a system called Voice, where workers can submit their complaints or their grievances, and they are analyzed by this organization that is paid by the industry. But there are no unions, there are no workers' reps, nothing. So this individual right to access a system that in fact puts you in isolation without any kind of support from any kind of organization is challenging for the union.
Exactly. So in the absence of the law, that's a yellow NGO, you know, like I said, yellow unions is basically run by the industry for PR purposes. They are not representing the worker interests. So if we had the law there protecting, and the law said these are the rights of the workers, even if the NGO was started by the industry, even eventually it would be controlled by the workers, right? Because then your rights flow from the law, not from the industry or from the employer. I think that's a very important distinction. And such NGOs should be outed by our media organizations, communications, etc., as to, you know, exactly who are you working for. And, you know, a lot of Amazon and Google, and they all have grievance procedures now. But they're not unions. They are set up by the company. And they can be given to the workers and they can be taken away at the stroke of a pen. That's not a real voice. Real voice is one where you have certain guarantees because it's your right. And it should be in the law. So Brazil has made progress, but the whole infrastructure is a house of cards because the law doesn't recognize these associations and doesn't grant those rights.
Can I say something directly to that?
Absolutely.
Sorry, speaking of the law. No, it's actually interesting because I actually did now some years ago, I did my PhD on the right to freedom of association. Because, you know, we're saying, okay, there's certain rights to form associations. So, you know, you can do it, right? But I think one of the things you said, which is critically important, is that people actually need support. You know, you need some money. You need some money from the government or other places. You need, you know, so we need some kind of, we need rights, but rights that are also associated with positive duties to support. And I think that's very much the human capability approach, is that it's not just about negative rights, not, you know, you don't disband my association, or you don't, you know, ban my trade union, you don't ban my strike, which is also associated with freedom of association. So I think the critical thing there is that the law has to be not just about a right to have an association, but a right to certain resources to be able to form an association. And now the only organizations that currently have those rights under international law, mostly are the unions. So something like, you know, the right to bargain collectively actually comes with positive duty. You okay? It comes under the ILO Convention.
Move so I can see you better.
With positive duties on states to establish and support collective bargaining machinery. So I think it's also good if we think about, you know, those more refined, you know, not just the rights to worker to voice, but so to have a voice, but the rights, more refined, positive rights and duties on the kinds of support and the kind of machinery that needs to be put in place. That I think
very useful distinction. I think it was Franklin and Bart.
I just want to add to Kalina's point. I think you make an excellent point. Now, because I'm not a lawyer, I haven't developed this further, but if you have any lawyers in the house, in ETUI, and if you want to do a paper, I'd be very happy to contribute. But what you have to do is you have to take the idea that, let's assume that the right to voice is embedded in the Constitution, for example. What are the next few steps? Because I can tell you how this might happen in Canada, because I'm more familiar with their legal system. But legal systems vary a lot, and you have to think of a generic model where this right in the Constitution would then translate into specific laws that might be addressing certain sectors or certain groups of workers, and the rights that would come with the formation of their own organization. So in case of trade union, we know, and standard employment, we know that once you have a trade union that's recognized as law, you have the right to dialogue, and you have the right to negotiate and sign contracts that are enforceable by law. So that whole thing follows. Now, this value chain may be slightly different for informal workers or for certain groups of workers. And hence, you need to hone this idea before it can become saleable. Sorry.
No, excellent. Franklin, thanks.
Yes, let's say, I have a question regarding if you know some kind of experience of waste picker in Africa, because I mean, in most of African cities, the question of waste is, I mean, disastrous in the sense that it's not well organized. I mean, municipalities or the states don't take, I mean, serious measure to tackle this issue. And at the same time, it's created a lot of, you know, health issue, public health issue. So do you have any kind of experience in Africa about this waste picker? Mm-hmm.
Well, I have to confess that I'm not very knowledgeable about Africa, but we, the ILO is organizing a big conference next month in July on regulating decent work. And I was reviewing some of their submissions, and I did see papers from Nigeria and Ghana there in that conference. So hopefully more research is being done and reported. So if you give me your contact, I can perhaps refer you. The conference happens July 3, 4, 5 or thereabouts. So hopefully that program will become public, and you should peruse that. You'll find a couple of papers on Africa.
I heard like Johannesburg courtyard sometimes, several floors of building filled with garbage.
But that's a really useful, thanks for flagging that, because that would be very useful. Well, Africa and other regions, of course. Okay, thank you very much. Bart, you had a question.
Yes, two questions. One is very, yeah, maybe just hands-on. The research that you do with speakers. I'm just wondering how you are received by them, because you mentioned stigma, you mentioned shame, all of these elements. So I'm just wondering what happens if you land there as a team of researchers from Canada. Are they welcoming you with open arms, or are they very skeptical? What are their expectations? You know, just a bit of a flavor of how that works as a research process.
Sure.
Yeah.
I have to confess that I hate my Canadian identity. I was flying under the radar. My wife is from Brazil, who was a professor of labor law. And so she and her students approached these associations. And actually, we were very warmly received. I am happy to report, because they feel so disempowered that if someone shows up who's sympathetic and wants to tell their story, they just lay it out. So we did individual interviews. We did some questionnaires that we distributed. We visited these places, and some of them are very remote. You know, you have to drive 4 hours in the heat to reach them. And some progressive towns had an environmental secretary. So on their city council, one person had the environmental file, and he or she was fostering the association. So some cities have donated land where they can build their sorting center. Some cities, one city has designated the workers as environmental workers, so they get half pay from the city. So from morning 8 till 12, they sweep the streets, they collect garbage, etc. Then the other half, they do their waste picker work, with which they can supplement their income. So it's also a model where they can earn a minimum wage, a decent wage, with the support of the municipality. So there are many examples like this where the city has tried to, and that was the mandate of the federal regulation in Brazil. It says that cities are encouraged to have recycling programs and to include waste pickers in their recycling program. Because the cities that don't do this, for example, we've lived in Fortaleza. It's a city of 3.5 million people. And all the waste is picked up by trucks and taken to a trash mountain. They just dump it there. And this trash mountain grows by the day. And it smells very foul for miles around the place. And it's getting large enough that now it's getting close to some communities where the smell, because there's a lot of money in this trash business. So that there's a private company that collects the trash and takes it to Trash Mountain. And their work will be modified if the waste pickers come in. So there is a kind of mafia element to this that cannot be ignored, but that's another story.
I had a second question, if I may. That's why I asked Maria to put this slide back on. So your second proposal is that various forms of workers' organizations, e.g. a trade union, a cooperative, an association, etc., should be recognized by labor law, etc. My guess is that if we were to show this slide in any meeting with any trade union organization at the national, at the regional, national, and EU level, it would immediately end the discussion. Because you're putting trade unions here at the same level on this slide, and it's not a criticism, it's just a fact, as a cooperative, an association, etc. And so my question is, how can we, is there a way to put this forward so that we can actually start a dialogue on the very good and core idea that is behind this? Because we've, I mean, of course, we work very closely with the European Trade Union Movement, ETC. And so the whole idea of having various forms of workers' organizations being recognized in law, treaties, etc., is a very sensitive one. So how do we, you know, how do we start that discussion?
So you're right. I think if you see it as a competition between trade union and other forms of organization, then it becomes a zero-sum game. So any gain in that side is a loss for this. But the way I would start the conversation is by saying that, look, you are not going to lose that which you don't have. You know, it'd be silly for me to say I lost $1 million because I don't have it in the bank, you know. So how can I lose what I don't have? So trade unions have an area of operation and influence and power. The question is, how do we enlarge it beyond where it is? And if more of these types of organizations could acquire rights through the law, it would be in the trade union interest to subsume them, right? Because then you could have your own associations. You know, it can be the branding can be the same. So, you know, IG Metall could have associations that are IG Metall associations, and they would acquire rights under the law. And they can be, and in fact, in a number of unions in Asia and in the Americas, at least those two I know better, there are large unions, including the global unions, that have in-house NGOs, for example, to help migrant workers. Now, they are not recognized by the law and they don't have any rights, but just as an outreach, they run these worker centers as a service to non-union workers. And what would happen under this proposal is that that NGO that, let's say, uni is running in Thailand to help migrant workers would now suddenly become recognized by law, and they would be able to enforce those rights for those workers. It would still be part of uni. So, but I think that you've got a very good question here. How do we flip the thinking from zero sum to win-win? And as an extension, so this perceived competition can be a collaboration. We have to be able to envision that and to make that happen. But I think the greatest enabling factor would be a change in the law.
It's interesting what you're saying. Just if I can come in, because our project work looking, the ETUI looking with the ILO at ways of extending union reach and having innovative servicing and innovative union governance suggests exactly what you're saying about a collaborative approach. So there are, and I can't give you the extent of this, but certainly anecdotally, there are unions that are providing support for workers to self-organize, for example. They're setting up special branches and so on and so forth. Now, sometimes that's with an instrumentalist aim, if you like, in terms of eventually gaining union membership, but sometimes it is simply to support those groups as well. So there are quite a few permutations that are bubbling away, and I don't get a sense of it all being cohesive and holistic, but certainly there's a lot of experimentation on the ground and beyond. But I'll come back to you with a question around this in a moment, and I think there were a couple more questions here.
Just want to come back on this question, if I may, because in fact, first, in many countries, cooperatives emerged before trade unions in history, so there shouldn't be any opposition. But the reality is that there are real cooperatives that are democratic, and others that are not democratic and are not really cooperatives. That's a fact. And so I think that the theory or the approach you take about workers' voice should be applied to this paragraph too. Are these organizations democratic? Are these the workers? Do the workers have a voice into these trade unions, cooperatives, associations, etc.? That's the key factor. If they are democratic, of course, why should trade unions fight against these associations or anything?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, the so-called co-ops, which is a British movement under Robert Owen. It also came to Canada, and in fact, we have a lot of co-ops in Canada, even to this day, especially in Western Canada. But you know, that law which recognizes co-ops is more like company law rather than labor law, right? Because it allows you to organize your economic activity in a certain format. And we have some studies. This is an interesting window. We looked at labor relations within these co-ops, and you see they do exactly the same thing that any private corporation does. So we have co-op banks. They treat their employees very badly, or as badly as any other bank. So they're co-op in a corporate sense, they're not co-op in a labor sense. Whereas what we are talking about here is a co-op that is of the workers, by the workers, and the rights under the law accrue to the workers. And we don't have that kind of co-op law in Canada.
More than a question, it was just a comment. Because we were mentioning, Kalina and myself, that sometimes this also is related to a global north and global south problem. And I'm really happy to be European, but sometimes I struggle to find a coherence in it because we're sending tons and tons of waste to Africa. And there are some good examples, and that's also related to Franklon's question in Africa and Morocco. In Meknes, actually, very close to Fez, there is a plan that has been created to first enlarge workforce, but formal workforce, and through waste pickers that were not into the formal work. But those initiatives are local and cannot tackle the tons of waste that are arriving there. And that's related to two ideas I had in mind. First, this should be tackled at some point, and there is a nice movement of liberation in Africa right now, stopping those relations between North and South that are not really linked to environment and workplace, but also regarding more macro level perspectives, such as stopping some currencies or the use of some currencies, such as dollar. And this happened actually 2 weeks ago in one concrete country. I don't remember, but I can tell you which. And the other idea was how could be controlled, or at least what is the role of the global North stopping this attitude towards the South.
You know, it's a class of problem within the larger. And just thinking on my feet, I would say, look, if you can create decent work associated with that trash, then why not? You know, it's creating employment there. But what should happen? Well, first of all, the global North should pay an appropriate price for processing that trash. Number two, the workers sorting the trash should have access to decent wage and safe working conditions. Thirdly, there should be place for them to sell the sorted recyclables and get a fair value for it. So if you can create this value chain, I'm all for shipping the trash to places where people don't have employment. But if you don't have those conditions, then you're just dumping garbage. And that is wrong.
And also sentencing to that those nice initiatives that will not be able to face the demands that we send. Thank you.
The voice of workers essential in every field. One of the most critical fields is healthcare. If we can remember, of course, it was not long ago, the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the most critical issues was not the availability of equipment, it was the human resources to treat people everywhere. And why was it also so critical in Europe? Many people may remind that in several countries, Belgium, other countries in Europe, and in other countries in the world, the budgets of healthcare were reduced significantly for different type of reasons. Because there were more important political priorities elsewhere. But when the COVID-19 appeared, then it was complicated because the voice of the healthcare workers was not heard previously. And especially in Europe, when we see that in almost all European countries and the Commission, and that's a link with the European Union, people say we didn't expect that. It is not true. Because for many years, there were studies how to react to pandemics. Studies funded by the European Union in FP7 in Horizon 2020. We were also part of some of these studies, my university, the University of Louvain, and also the healthcare service I developed, supported by the funding of the European Space Agency called BLIFE. BLIFE stands for Biological Light Fieldable Laboratory for Emergencies. And all those studies were already available to the government. They were sent to the European Union, to the government. Another point related to the European Union was that the European Union has capabilities in healthcare. Contrary to what some people are saying, there is a mechanism called the European Union Civil Protection Mechanism, which is coordinated by DG ECHO. And this mechanism started already more than 10 years, 12 years ago, as an annual budget of, I think it was around 2.5 billion euros. This mechanism has been used in some cases. For example, in 2014, there was the epidemics of Ebola in Africa. We deployed our capabilities with the support of the European Space Agency, but also with the support of the EU Civil Protection Mechanism. And our lab was part of this mechanism. We were certified in this European mechanism. But in 2020, during the pandemic, this mechanism, which should have worked for European countries, didn't work at all. Nothing worked there. They just had some budgets to fund the travel expenses of European citizens, which could not come back in Europe because the airline companies could not fund it. But the mechanism did not work. And I've seen that myself, and our teams have seen that. Because for an example is Italy. Italy asked the help of the European Union because it was very critical in the northern Italy. And I've been there in the field myself. The European Union did not respond. The Italian government asked in a bilateral agreement with Belgium, could you help us? No answer from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. No answer. So we built a response which was mixed, private, and supported by the European Space Agency, because the European Space Agency is not the European Union. It's a multilateral government institution which is more proactive in some cases. And with the Luxembourg government, we could do a mission of several months in the north of Italy. I've been myself there. So the question is, why did Europe fail in this mechanism, which was built by Europe? And of course, we can see why it failed. It was a lack of leadership, it was a lack of coordination, it was a lack of many things, but it was not a lack of budget. In 2017, just to finish on that, 2017 and several years before, there were exercises with missions, but which were not simulated missions, but exercises made at a European level by the EU Civil Protection Mechanism. And I've been part of one of these exercises in 2017 in Sweden. And the purpose was to respond to the cholera epidemics. So that was the purpose of this mechanism and the DG ECHO. And there were many field hospitals, many resources coming from Spain, Italy, Germany, and Belgium. We were there with the mobile app. And it worked. It was field exercise, but it worked. And people responsible of the Commission, DG ECHO, said at that time, that's how the European Union should work. I still have the comments and the video of everything.
So
it didn't work.
So you've given examples of what did and didn't work. How would you relay that to?
I think what is needed is what you have said previously. The voice of workers should be heard, and people at the political level should listen to the people in the field, either through unions or informal, because as you know, in healthcare, there were also many informal workers. Sure. That's probably one of the largest fields where there are informal workers. And those people in the field know what is happening and what will happen, because such epidemics and pandemics will come again. Mm-hmm. Are we prepared to that? No. That's why it's important to do something.
Certainly, the people you're talking about are at the sharp end of that as well.
Yeah, actually in hospitals, we have several examples of where the vaccines arrived and they said you can give it to all the hospital employees, but the laundry was being done by a subcontract. And when those workers wanted the vaccine, they said, oh no, but you're not an employee of the hospital, we can't give it to you. It was the utter stupidity, because of course those workers are coming into the hospital and they would spread the infection if you don't give them. But you know, there were these things, and it occurs because workers were not consulted. I just want to put in a plug for a chapter that we wrote for the Oxford Handbook of Labor Law. And it is a chapter called Labor Policy in the Time of COVID. So the idea was, what did we learn from the pandemic that would be useful in the next pandemic? And one of the biggest mistakes that governments made was that they stopped talking to workers because things were happening quickly. So there was an excuse that, no, you know, this is an unusual time. There's no time to consult. We will just roll out policy unilaterally. And that's where the biggest mistakes were made. But take a look at our chapter, because we summarize the entire evidence topic by topic
If
by
if you
topic.
need some additional information, I would be happy to provide you
Okay,
more of this information because I was in the field
Yeah.
during all the COVID.
and this lack of consultation happened in many countries, so we did an international, we took a look at it internationally. But I didn't know about the EU exam, so it's good.
It's interesting. Any more questions, please? So I've got one, and then perhaps Kalina.
Does anyone else feel like I've spoken a lot?
No, no,
So
it's good, but you've.
No, actually, I just wanted to. It wasn't actually a question. It was just coming back to like putting together a few of the things that were said. I actually wanted to refer to the work that someone who she's a master's student of Paulo. Actually, she was a trainee with me. She's writing her master's thesis on urban mining, which is, urban mining is basically the extraction of resources from waste. And it's kind of what we've talked about. What you've talked about is kind of this recycling at the local level. But you yourself said, okay, how do we connect this to the big picture? And I think, we talked a little bit about also actually global waste supply like waste treatment chains. However, with the kind of shift to a green circular economy, those are in some ways now actually becoming also supply chains of resources. And, one of the things that she argues, and I should actually put you in touch because she uses Brazil, and she's from Turkey, so she uses Brazil and Turkey as case studies for this. But one of the things that she's arguing is that actually the circular economy has a new potential to be kind of this new extractivism, a kind of, green extractivism, including from resources and from workers who are operating at this local level. So it's really interesting how maybe even with the shift to a green economy, if we don't change some of the logic of extractivism in general, and that changing that logic includes empowering workers who are not a resource. And I wonder how that, in the end of the day, just kind of empowerment at the local level also just really has the potential to filter to this like bigger picture things. But it's really fantastic work. And she even herself said that no one's really connected this idea of urban mining with like global green extractivism and supply chains. So it's also a very interesting topic.
Yep, I think you got something there. It's circular and recycling, and it's more likely to happen if you involve waste pickers.
Yeah.
If they're engaged, they could improve the recycling globally, especially in the developing countries. But it may also be true in parts of the EU.
Thank you. Okay, just a caveat. I too am not a labour lawyer, for those who are, but I have a question around law, if you like, in terms of thinking about informal workers, including waste pickers. And I mean, it seems there's two tranches of key activity, one around changing our notions or conceptions of what the employment relationship is in law. And we've seen that with some gig workers and bringing them into the fold, if you like, of more formalized regulatory employment. But also whether then the other tranche might be to then regularize within the informal economy. And I'm just wondering how those two positions sit with what you're suggesting. It sounds like your work covers both of those areas, but I'd like to hear from you things about that.
So, gig workers to me fall into a category where there is a perceivable employer. It's just that they're hiding behind some kind of technological or administrative arrangement. It's initially, if you go back to before gig work, we had subcontractors, right? So let's say Apple's subcontracts the cleaning of the building to a company, and then you say to that worker that, but you don't work for Apple.
Yeah.
Even though you are here every day, you spend all your time here, 100% of your activity is service given to Apple. Apple is not really your employer. And there have been cases where the employer of those workers went bankrupt or didn't pay wages. And the principal employer, I don't mean to cite Apple, but just I'm taking an example. The principal employer said, oh, but you are not our worker, so we have no liability vis-a-vis you. Oh, so in other words, there is an employer, but they're hiding behind a corporate structure or behind a technological structure. And there, I think the EU work is exemplary, where they have said, no, we can see you, the employer there. So you have liabilities towards these workers. So extend the laws to recognize their obligations as an employer. But the base speakers are purely informal workers, self-employed. They are dependent workers in the sense that they depend on this activity for their economic well-being, but they don't have an employer, right? So you have everything from no identifiable employer to an employer who's hiding behind certain structures to an employer. And right now, labor law just only covers where we can identify an employer, and just beginning to go into the second segment of where employer is not obvious, but is present and can be reached by the law. And then you have the informal workers where the employer is not identifiable. And at one level, you can read my ideas today that I presented as saying that labor law should extend itself to all economic activity. That employment should not be a prerequisite for acquiring labor rights.
Yes.
As long as I'm involved in economically productive work. Now we exclude, at least I exclude unpaid work, which is another category where some feminist writers have argued that, work done at home is economic work and it contributes to the GDP indirectly, although we don't recognize and should be recognized by the law. But that's another level of discussion. But I'm saying at least people who are participating in the market economy by making an economic contribution, their rights should be covered by labor law.
Thank you. Any other further last questions? We have about 5 minutes. I think that's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you so much, Anil, for all your comments and insights. I think that this gives us a new framework to think about, and hopefully one that will come to fruition as it gets more and more traction on the ground. So with no further ado, thank you, everybody, for coming along today. As I say, this is a recorded event, and so the resource will be made available to you and publicly, if that's all right with everybody in the room. And yes, no more to be said really then. Thank you. Oh, except if you'd like to speak, Anil.
So I have a last word.
Yeah.
I want to throw the challenge to Bart and his team to lead the way, to open the space for this discussion of how trade unions can be enablers of this extension of labor law. Because I see the possibility, but maybe not many other people see it. But let's go and discover what it is.
Thank you. Well, I just actually to have another last word. the current project ETUI and work with ILO ACTRA. This is one of the central questions. So hopefully we'll be able to pull together some anecdotal and primary research very soon and present that, I think, around September at ILO, so that we'll have some sort of response to you for that. Yeah, thank you.
And we will pick up the gauntlet. I can already conclude that.
Thank you.
So thanks for the challenge. We accept it.
All right.
And thank you, Anil. Thank you.